A 1923 orphanage photograph shows a boy pointing at something outside the frame. Disciplinary reports reveal he kept talking to the man in the garden who supposedly didn't exist. When archivists find photographic evidence of this mysterious figure lurking in the abandoned property next door, the truth behind his gesture will shatter everything they thought they knew. In the dusty archives of the Chicago Historical Society, archivist Margaret Chen carefully handles a weathered photograph from 1923. The black and white image shows 37 children standing in neat rows outside the Mercy Heights orphanage. Their faces show the serious expressions common to that time period. What she doesn't know yet is that this seemingly innocent photograph will lead her down a path that challenges everything she thought she knew about historical records and human memory. The photograph was given to them by the family of Nena Whitmore, a 94-year-old woman who had passed away 3 months earlier. Among her belongings, family members found boxes of papers related to her work as a social reformer in the 1920s. Nena had spent her life fighting for children's rights and orphanage reform, but she had never spoken about this particular photograph to anyone in her family. Margaret adjusts her magnifying glass and begins her routine cataloging process. The children in the photograph are between about 5 and 16 years old. They're dressed in the simple dark clothing typical of institutional care during that period. The building behind them is made of imposing red brick with tall windows. Its stern architectural presence speaks to the no-nonsense approach of early 20th century child welfare. As Margaret examines the photograph more closely, she notices something peculiar. In the back row, standing third from the left, is a boy who appears to be about 12 years old. Unlike the other children who stare directly at the camera with neutral expressions, this boy's gaze seems to be fixed on something just outside the frame. His posture is slightly different, too. While the others stand with their arms at their sides, his left hand appears to be pointing subtly toward the right edge of the photograph. Margaret makes a note of this detail and continues her examination. She photographs the image with high-resolution equipment, planning to digitize it for the Historical Society's online archive. As she works, she can't shake the feeling that there's something more to this photograph than meets the eye. Later that evening, Margaret decides to research the Mercy Heights orphanage. The institution operated from 1889 to 1959 on Chicago's South Side, housing hundreds of children over its 7 decades of operation. The orphanage was known for its strict discipline and sparse conditions, but also for its relatively low death rate compared to other institutions of the time. Margaret discovers that the orphanage kept detailed records, and many of these documents have been preserved in various Chicago archives. She makes appointments to visit these locations, hoping to find more information about the children in the photograph. She also wants to learn more about the context in which it was taken. The next morning, Margaret arrives at the Chicago City Archives, where she meets with senior archivist David Rodriguez. David has worked with historical documents for over 20 years and has a particular interest in social welfare institutions of the early 1900s. The Mercy Heights records are quite comprehensive, David explains as he leads Margaret through the climate-controlled storage area. They documented everything: admissions, departures, disciplinary actions, educational progress, even medical records. The administrators were very thorough. David pulls out several boxes of documents from 1923. Margaret explains about the photograph and her interest in identifying the children pictured. Together, they begin cross-referencing the orphanage's records with the faces in the photograph. The process is painstaking. They examine admission records looking for children who would have been at the orphanage in 1923 and whose ages match those in the photograph. Gradually, they begin to identify some of the children. There's Maria Sullivan, age 8, admitted after her parents died in a tenement fire. Thomas Mitchell, age 14, brought to the orphanage after being found living on the streets. Sarah Kowalski, age 6, whose immigrant parents couldn't afford to care for her. But when they get to the boy in the back row, the one whose gaze seems fixed on something outside the frame, they encounter their first mystery. According to the records, his name is James Fletcher, age 12, admitted to the orphanage in 1921 after his mother died of tuberculosis. His father was listed as unknown. What's strange about James Fletcher's file is that it contains an unusual number of disciplinary reports. Most children at Mercy Heights had occasional infractions noted in their files. Talking during meals, failure to complete chores, minor acts of defiance. But James's file is thick, with reports of more concerning behavior. He kept talking about the man in the garden. Margaret reads from one report dated October 1922. Staff have repeatedly told James that there is no man in the garden, but he insists on this story. Yesterday he was found at the garden fence at dawn, claiming he was meeting with the man. He has been given extra kitchen duties as punishment for lying. Another report from December 1922 states, James Fletcher continues to display concerning behavior. He has been seen talking to himself in the garden area and pointing toward the abandoned Henley property next door. When questioned, he claims he is talking to the man who helps him. Medical examination shows no signs of illness. Recommend continued observation. David looks up from the documents with a furrowed brow. This is unusual. The staff at Mercy Heights were generally quite understanding of children's emotional needs, given the trauma most of these kids had experienced. For them to be this concerned about James's behavior suggests something significant was happening. Margaret pulls out her high-resolution photograph of the image and studies James Fletcher's face more carefully. Even in the black and white photograph, she can see that his expression is different from the other children. There's an intensity in his eyes, and his slight smile seems to suggest he knows something the others don't. David, Margaret says slowly, look at where James is pointing in this photograph. He's indicating something to the right of the frame. According to these reports, he was always talking about someone in the garden area. What if what he was pointing at was actually there? David finishes her thought. But that would mean, Margaret nods, it would mean there was someone just outside the photographer's view when this picture was taken. Someone the other children couldn't see or chose to ignore, but someone James was very aware of. They spend the rest of the day going through more records looking for any additional information about James Fletcher or about any incidents at the orphanage during 1923. What they find is both illuminating and disturbing. In January 1923, just a few months before the photograph would have been taken, there were several reports of strange occurrences at the orphanage. Kitchen staff reported finding doors unlocked in the morning that had been secured the night before. Night supervisors noted unusual sounds coming from the garden area. Most significantly, there were reports of food going missing from the kitchen stores. The orphanage's director, Sister Catherine Murphy, had written a letter to the board of directors in February 1923, expressing concern about what she called security issues at the facility. She mentioned that several children, led by James Fletcher, claimed they had been helping someone who needed food. The children insist they are telling the truth, Sister Catherine wrote. Young Fletcher is particularly adamant about this person he claims to have befriended. While I am inclined to attribute this to the children's imagination, the missing food supplies are very real, and we must consider the possibility that someone is indeed taking advantage of the children's kindness. Margaret and David exchange glances. The pieces of a puzzle are starting to come together, but the picture they're forming is far from clear. We need to find out more about the area around the orphanage in 1923, Margaret says. Specifically about this Henley property that was mentioned in James's disciplinary reports. David accesses the Chicago Property Records database on his computer. The Henley property was a large estate adjacent to the Mercy Heights orphanage. In 1920, the property was abandoned after the death of its owner, Herbert Henley, a wealthy industrialist who had no surviving family members. The property sat empty for several years, David reads from the records. There were ongoing legal battles about the estate, and the property fell into disrepair. It wasn't sold and developed until 1927. Margaret realizes the significance of this timing. So for 3 years, from 1920 to 1923, there was an abandoned property right next door to the orphanage. The perfect place for someone to hide if they needed to stay out of sight. But who would be hiding there? David asks. And why would they be interacting with the orphanage children? Margaret has been thinking about this question. What if it was someone who had a connection to the orphanage? Someone who couldn't officially be there but felt compelled to help the children somehow? They decide to research the staff records for Mercy Heights, looking for anyone who might have left the institution around 1920 and could have had reason to remain in the area. What they discover is remarkable. In March 1920, a maintenance worker named William Chen had been dismissed from his position at the orphanage under circumstances that the records describe only as unsuitable conduct with no criminal implications. William had worked at Mercy Heights for 8 years and was well liked by both staff and children. Margaret notes that William Chen shares her surname, though she's certain there's no family connection. Chen isn't an uncommon name, she tells David, but it's interesting. The personnel file reveals that William Chen was a Chinese immigrant who had come to Chicago in 1910. He was skilled in carpentry and general maintenance, and during his time at the orphanage, he had been particularly good with the children. Several reports praised his patience and kindness, especially with the younger residents who were having difficulty adjusting to institutional life. However, in early 1920, there had been an incident. The details are vague, but it appears that William had been providing extra food to some of the children, who he felt were not getting adequate nutrition. While his intentions were good, this went against orphanage policy and created problems with the carefully rationed food supplies. So, William Chen was dismissed for essentially the same thing James Fletcher claimed to be doing 3 years later, Margaret observes, helping someone who needed food. David nods thoughtfully. And if William had been living in the abandoned Henley property since 1920, he would have been in a position to continue helping the children, even if he could no longer work at the orphanage officially. Margaret studies the photograph again, this time with new understanding. James Fletcher's pointing gesture takes on new significance. He wasn't pointing at something mysterious or supernatural. He was pointing at a friend, someone who had shown him kindness and whom he wanted to acknowledge, even if he couldn't explain the relationship to the adults around him. But why didn't the orphanage staff investigate more thoroughly? Margaret wonders. If children were claiming to interact with someone and food was going missing, why didn't they search the adjacent property? David has been thinking about this too. Remember, this was 1923. Anti-immigrant sentiment was very high, especially against Chinese immigrants. If the orphanage staff suspected that William Chen was still in the area, they might have been reluctant to get involved with local authorities. It would have created a scandal that could have damaged the institution's reputation. Margaret realizes that David is probably right. The orphanage depended on donations and community support. A scandal involving a dismissed Chinese worker would have been devastating to their funding and public image. So they chose to handle it quietly, Margaret says. They disciplined the children for lying about the man in the garden, but they didn't actually try to stop what was happening. Over the following days, Margaret becomes increasingly absorbed in the story of James Fletcher and William Chen. She returns to the Chicago Historical Society archives and begins looking for any additional photographs from Mercy Heights that might provide more clues. In a box of materials donated by a different family, she finds 3 more photographs from the orphanage, all taken in the summer of 1923. In 2 of the photographs, she can clearly see James Fletcher. And in both images, his attention seems to be directed towards something outside the frame. But it's the 3rd photograph that provides the breakthrough Margaret has been hoping for. This image shows a group of children working in the orphanage's vegetable garden. In the background, barely visible among the overgrown vegetation of the adjacent property, she can make out the partial figure of a man. Margaret uses digital enhancement software to enlarge and clarify this section of the photograph. The figure is definitely an adult male wearing simple work clothes and appearing to be middle-aged. Most importantly, he seems to be watching the children with a kind expression. This has to be William Chen, Margaret tells David when she shows him the enhanced image. He was still in the area in 1923, probably living in the abandoned Henley house, and he was maintaining some kind of relationship with the orphanage children. David agrees, but he raises an important question. So what happened to him? The Henley property was sold in 1927, so he would have had to leave at that point. Did he relocate? Did he find other work? Did he reconnect with any family? Margaret decides to expand her research to see if she can trace William Chen's life beyond 1923. She contacts other historical societies and immigration records offices, looking for any trace of his later life. What she discovers is both heartening and sad. In 1928, William Chen appears in the records of a Chinese Benevolent Association in San Francisco. He had traveled west and found work as a carpenter, eventually opening a small furniture repair shop in Chinatown. Most remarkably, William had married in 1930 and had 3 children. The records show that he lived a quiet, productive life until his death in 1967 at the age of 78. His obituary in a Chinese-language newspaper describes him as a kind man who never forgot the children he had helped in Chicago. But the most touching discovery comes from a letter Margaret finds in the San Francisco Chinese Historical Society archives. In 1954, William Chen had written to a friend about his time in Chicago. In the letter, he mentions his work at the Mercy Heights orphanage and his dismissal. "I was sad to leave the children," he wrote in Chinese, "but I could not abandon them completely. For several years I stayed nearby and helped when I could. There was one boy, James, who understood that sometimes adults must help each other even when the rules say we cannot. I hope he remembered that lesson as he grew up." Margaret realizes that this letter confirms everything she and David have theorized about the relationship between William Chen and James Fletcher. But she still wants to know what happened to James himself. Tracing James Fletcher's life proves more challenging. The orphanage records show that he left Mercy Heights in 1925 at the age of 14, as was typical for boys who were considered old enough to work. He was placed with a family in Milwaukee who needed help on their farm. After that, James Fletcher's trail becomes difficult to follow. Margaret searches through Milwaukee city records, military enlistment records, and census data. But James seems to have lived a quiet life that left few official traces. Finally, through a genealogy website, Margaret makes contact with a woman named Patricia Fletcher Thompson, who believes James Fletcher may have been her grandfather. Patricia lives in Denver and agrees to speak with Margaret by phone. Grandpa Jim rarely talked about his time at the orphanage, Patricia tells Margaret. But when he did, he always mentioned a Chinese man who had been kind to him. He said this man taught him that helping others was more important than following rules, and that lesson shaped his whole life. Patricia explains that James Fletcher had indeed worked on a farm in Milwaukee until he was 18, then moved to Colorado where he found work in the mining industry. He married young, had 4 children, and spent his life quietly helping others in his community. He was always bringing home stray animals or helping neighbors who were struggling. Patricia says, "My grandmother used to joke that he couldn't see anyone in need without trying to help." She said it was like he had learned early in life that kindness was the most important thing a person could offer. James Fletcher had died in 1982 at the age of 73. Surrounded by a large extended family who remembered him as a gentle, generous man who never spoke badly of anyone and who always found ways to help those who were less fortunate. Margaret feels a deep satisfaction as she pieces together this story. The hidden detail in the photograph, James Fletcher's pointing gesture, has led her to uncover a beautiful story of human connection and kindness that transcended the formal rules and racial barriers of the 1920s. The photograph itself takes on new meaning. It's not just a documentation of children at an orphanage. It's a record of a moment when a young boy wanted to acknowledge a friend who had shown him kindness, even though that friendship existed outside the approved boundaries of his institutional life. Margaret prepares her final report for the Chicago Historical Society, documenting not just the photograph but the entire story she has uncovered. She includes copies of all the records she has found, the enhanced images showing William Chen in the background, and the information about both men's later lives. But as she writes her conclusion, Margaret realizes that the story raises important questions about how we interpret historical documents. How many other photographs contain hidden details that reveal untold stories of human connection? How many official records fail to capture the full complexity of people's lives and relationships? The photograph from Mercy Heights Orphanage will now be displayed with a full explanation of its context, including the story of James Fletcher and William Chen. What appeared to be a simple institutional photograph has become a window into a remarkable story of friendship, kindness, and the ways people find to help each other even when official systems try to keep them apart. Margaret contacts Patricia Fletcher Thompson one more time to share the complete story she has uncovered. Patricia is moved to learn about her grandfather's connection to William Chen and asks if she can have copies of the photographs and documents. "I wish I could have known about Mr. Chen when Grandpa was still alive," Patricia says. "I think he would have been so happy to know that someone had figured out the truth about their friendship. He never forgot that man's kindness, and now I understand why." As Margaret finishes her work on this project, she reflects on the power of careful historical research to uncover human stories that might otherwise be lost. The photograph from Mercy Heights Orphanage will continue to be studied by historians and genealogists. But now it will be understood not as a mysterious image with an unexplained detail, but as a touching record of friendship and mutual support during a difficult period in American history. The hidden detail that initially puzzled Margaret, James Fletcher's pointing gesture, turned out to be not mysterious at all, but profoundly human. It was simply a boy's way of acknowledging someone who had shown him kindness, a small gesture that preserved the memory of an important friendship across nearly a century of time.